Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this very special webinar, which is all about student equity and remote learning. Now, equity has been a subject that's been brought up a lot in the past few weeks, especially now that most teachers across the world, as I'm sure you can relate to, are teaching from home. And most students are learning from home. So like a lot of teachers out there, we at Wakelet, me in particular, I wanted to learn a little bit more about equity, what it means, and ensuring that students get equal opportunities to learn during this really strange time right now, regardless of the many different situations that they might find themselves in as students. So please, introduce yourselves in the chat, make new friends. It's always good to make new friends at webinars, share contact information if you want, and ask as many questions as you like as well. Hopefully we'll be able to answer as many as we can in the next 40 minutes. This particular webinar, we didn't want to focus it so much around Wakelet and the platform. We may bring Wakelet in every now and again, but really this is mainly for the community to just understand a little bit more about this subject. Now, hopefully we won't experience any technical issues today, but if you can't hear us or see us, usually just closing the window and opening it up again helps. And we'll also be releasing a recording of this webinar early next week as well, if anything does mess up. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest today, Ken Shelton. He's a leading figure in the student equity conversation, a TEDx speaker, a good friend of mine, and I'm sure many of you know him as one of the leading voices in the EdTech community. Ken, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so it's good to be here. As I'm watching the chat, I hope everybody is doing okay. Can I just get like a yes or a thumbs up that you all are making sure you're taking care of yourselves? Someone said no audio for me.
Oh,
You can
yeah.
hear me okay?
Yeah, everybody, I think some people may be able to hear you, some people won't. If anybody is experiencing those issues, like I said, try and close the window and bring it back again. But yeah, most people will be able to hear us, Ken.
Okay. Yeah, because the self-care is critical for all of us. I mean, I'm glad to be here. It's an important conversation for us to have. I will share with you all we have some questions set up that I'll be able to share with you all some things that hopefully will provide additional areas of thought, additional areas of support, and perhaps some things that you could do now if you're a classroom teacher, if you're a school leader, or a site level administrator, or you're an administrator for your school system or your school board. I think it's important for us to be mindful of many of the challenges that exist for our students, because we cannot guarantee, the types of environments that they are forced to try to learn in now. So I'm happy to be here and looking forward to the time that we spend together over the next 50 minutes.
Amazing. And yeah, like I always say, as educators, we really appreciate you taking the time out to actually join us today, given the fact that you're not only dealing with the situation for yourselves and your own families, as Ken says, but you've also got the responsibility of all of your students. So I'm sure you miss a lot as well. So yeah, just everybody knows, the situation that we're in right now, facing a global pandemic, really uncharted waters for a lot of teachers and educators, uncharted waters for everybody, really. And one of the questions that keeps getting brought up in a lot of the webinars that we've been doing here at Wakelet is this idea of equity, is this idea of students being able to all enjoy the same level of teaching regardless of the circumstances that they might find themselves in. So we're going to go through a few questions with Ken, and Ken, let's start with a question which I think is on a lot of teachers' lips. What exactly do we mean when we use the phrase student equity? And I'm going to share my screen with an image here that Ken shared with me earlier. Let me just do that now, and then once I bring up the image, then we'll be able to discuss it a little bit. So hopefully everybody should see my screen now. I think we can.
Yeah, so what everyone's looking at, that's a graphic I use in I use it in a couple of my talks around, it gives you a visual representation of equality, which means that everyone has access. So even using that graphic, the first image would be, for example, if every school gave a student a device. And so then next to it, to the right of it, is equity, where it's not just giving out devices, it's making sure that resources are appropriately allocated to meet the needs of each individual. And then, of course, later on, which we can touch on a little bit, later on in this particular webinar, are the liberation and transformation, which those are the more sustainable and longer term, hopefully faster term, goals that we should have as educators to ensure equity and access for all of our students. And in fact, I'll even just share with everyone, I can even put in the chat. I simply define equity as access and opportunity. What access are we providing our students? And then based on that access, what opportunities does it provide?
Right, and I love that. I think that image really kind of sums it up in a really cool way. You know, a lot of people struggle with the access, well, the definition of equity, and like Ken said, you know, how are we supposed to really understand something and change something if we don't really understand the definition of it in the first place? So I really do love that graphic. I think that it says a lot. It's not just kind of blindly giving every student a device and expecting, you know, them to kind of just deal with it. You know, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, isn't it? There's a little bit more going in. It's making sure that you develop relationships with students and understand what it is that they need from the way that you teach. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into really the main question, the first question of the webinar today. So, like I said before, Ken, it's a completely new and unprecedented way of teaching for almost every single teacher worldwide. You know, throughout the webinars that we've been doing, we've seen lots of different challenges that teachers are facing come up every single day. What to you are some of the biggest challenges that you expect educators to face during this remote learning process?
So it's in two areas. One is the massive adjustment that we've all had to make. You know, literally turning on a dime, if you will, because a lot of this has hit a lot of all of us very quickly. We can anticipate certain things, but there's that adjustment that's had to be made, and then also you know, the shift from face-to-face learning to online learning. And I do want to stress that this is something that I share with educators as well, is that online learning and distance learning are not the same. E-learning, and in fact, e-learning, if you really want to call it, e-learning and distance learning are not the same. First of all, it's a completely different pedagogy than face-to-face. And distance learning is like, you can do distance learning without technology. And I can even share with you all where, you know, especially earlier in this century, when people were doing things like correspondence courses at universities that weren't within the, you know, the geographical area of where they live, they would send them packets of things that they have to do, and then they send those packets back via snail mail. So that's distance learning. So what we're doing now is a combination of both distance learning and e-learning, which requires a completely different pedagogical mindset. And it also requires a completely different approach to how we do learning, which is one of the reasons why, you know, I'm seeing some educators doing it now, which is great, is you cannot treat the day as the same as you would at a school. You can't have class from let's say 9 in the morning to 9:50, then 10 to 10:50, and so on and so forth. It doesn't work that way. One, because you have restricted or limited movement. Two, because when you go to a school, your day has contrast, if you will. During those times where you're not in class, there's the social aspect. When you're at home, unless you intentionally plan for it, you don't have that social connection, which, by the way, is why I'm harping on it, and I'm going to continue to harp on it, is we want to be mindful of the terminology we use, because I hear the media always saying social distancing, and that's dangerous and that's wrong. It's physical distancing, but remaining socially connected. So like you and I are physically distant right now, but we're socially connected. And so I think it's important for us to be mindful of that, and to also recognize that however we feel as adults in many cases is going to be amplified in kids. And a big reason why it's going to be amplified in kids is because a lot of children do not have the experiential understanding or the experience to be able to effectively articulate how they're thinking and how they're feeling. This is why I'm so glad that, you know, even things like social emotional learning are being pushed more into schools, and for people to be more aware of it. Because if you can't articulate how you're thinking, what you're thinking, or how you're feeling, all it does is it becomes essentially a continuous path towards self-induced trauma. So my main point in answering your question, though, is that it's hard on all of us because it is a major adjustment. And in many cases, I've seen school systems, if you will, that are like, all right, we need to go online learning. We need to do it right now. And you need to have all your lessons up. And of course, you know, if you think back to, I mean, even just think back the last 9 months, how many times have teachers or even school systems provided professional development on this?
Mm-hmm.
What type of professional development was provided? I mean, I have another blog posting, and I've got so many blog postings that my brain with writing, it just, eventually I'll publish them. But I would even ask, you know, the last time you went to a conference, what sessions did you attend? Did you attend 100 apps in 60 minutes? And how's that working for you now? You know,
Right.
we have to do things that provide us with a wider aperture, if you will, to be able to be responsive to the needs of our students. And I think I am seeing where a lot of school districts are starting to provide professional development for the teachers as they begin the shift. And they're also articulating to the teachers that they don't expect them to have it down or have it be quote unquote amazing right away. It's a work in progress. So
Yeah.
that's I'm hearing and seeing a lot of all of the above.
Yeah. 100%. I think that's a kind of an issue that's been echoed a lot in my experience when speaking with educators. It's like this pressure that they feel immediately to, take every bit of teaching that they do in the classroom and try and emulate or replicate that in this situation. It's not going to happen. So, what we've been kind of advising educators is, take it easy. Make sure that you're safe and that you're secure and that your mind is your mind is switched on to this new way of working. Don't think that you're going to be able to achieve all those learning outcomes that you set out in the classroom a couple of months ago. That's impossible. And again, I love going back to that point that you said. It's not necessarily about the platforms that you're using. It's not necessarily being like, okay, now that I'm remote learning, I've got to use all these platforms. It's how you use them effectively. Just to reiterate the point that you made as well, again, Ken, it's remote learning can work without tech, right? Tech is just there to kind of enhance the same way that teaching should be in general, I guess. You don't kind of bring the TV in and just let the kids stare at it, right? It's how you
Yeah.
use that technology that's really important. But yeah, really, really good points there, and I think that a lot of the audience agrees with you as well. We've got a message here from Chris saying that special ed students even need a lot more care as well and thought put into the way that they learn in this environment. So yeah, completely agree with you, Chris, and a lot of those concerns are also echoed in a lot of the educators that we've spoken to on these webinars as well. Ken, one of the biggest challenges that we've heard about is the lack of equipment and devices that students might have. So, some students, might not necessarily have access to devices. There could, in some households, just be one device for the whole household.
Yeah.
In internet connectivity issues, not every household is connected to the internet. What do you feel educators can do, or not necessarily solve the problem, but how should they react and deal with issues that they may be facing that are along these lines that are quite practical and logistical?
Right. So, and I'm glad you're asking that question. You know, what I would say to everyone on this webinar is the following with this. One, that's why the very first question I asked was, are you doing appropriate, actually appropriate is not the right word. Are you doing effective self-care strategies? You have to take care of yourself first and foremost. Self-care is not selfish, number one. Number two, you want to take things on a case-by-case basis. And what I mean by that is I'm seeing posted on social media like, here's tips you can do, here's things you can do. Use those as a solution, but not the solution. And it's really important to do things on a case-by-case basis. So one teacher who has one set of students is going to have one set of challenges versus a teacher that has a completely different set of students. And if you really think about it, for everyone on this webinar, think about it in terms of one class. How many varying needs are in one class, let alone one school, let alone one school district, and so on and so forth. So if you really say, okay, what is in the library of opportunities, access and opportunities I can provide for my students, and then which ones are going to be best fit for each of my students. In some cases, it might be something that works for all students. And that's why I'm glad there was a comment in the message thread here for our students that are under special education services. I mean, I'm sure that teachers are challenged with meeting the accommodations that are in an IEP or a 504 plan right now, because you cannot guarantee what the environment is that the child is working in. Well, guess what? That also applies to students that don't receive special education services or that don't have a 504 plan. So I really think that we want to be cautious that all these solutions that are being thrown out on social media, email, and all those sorts of things, identify which ones are likely to be the most effective for you on an individual case-by-case basis, and not worry about following some prescribed formula that either a school leader or school district or someone else is putting out on social media. And then the other thing that I've encouraged a lot of my friends, that especially here in the US, is I'm noticing a lot of the responsibility and weight is being placed on teachers. Do you have a TA? Have you contacted the assistant principals, the principal? I mean, there's all this support staff at a school that ideally we can look at it from a community perspective and say, okay, I can contact, X number of students in my class. I had an aide, so maybe I can ask my aide to contact the other students in the class, or we can do some sort of shared communication. In other words, turn this into more of a community of learning. Whereas, I guess the best way I can describe it is this. At school, we have our boundaries that constitute our classrooms. Those boundaries don't exist right now. And so therefore, why not use school as a community thing? Say, okay, as a department, if you will, why don't we make sure that we've contacted all of our students to let them know that we're thinking about their health, both mental and physical. We're looking at different ways that we can meet their different needs, so that way some degree of learning will continue, and go from there. So for me, it's like all teachers lean on the resources that you do have. Don't take the whole thing on for yourself. And if it becomes more of a shared community endeavor, then no one person is going to essentially bear a disproportionate degree of responsibility for it.
So if teachers are facing situations like that, it's look around, you're not on your own, right? Look around and see if you can get some support from the school community. And rather than making the focus on the tech, there are other methods as well. I know that I've heard from some teachers, they're planning on printing out booklets and actually physically printing out things on their own printers or printers in school, and just finding a delivery method to try and get these this information and at least this learning material to students who may not have access to devices or laptops or internet connection for that matter. I think that the point that you're making, Ken, I guess the way that I've interpreted it is that teaching doesn't change. It doesn't all of a sudden become extremely reliant on tech. It's always been a community, so it's about using what you can in that community to your advantage. Just one thing from our side as well, we found that it's been really important for us to focus on our app at Wakelet as well. We're looking now at ways to really improve the accessibility of our app, supercharge it, make it in line with the desktop, just because we know that if a student might not have a laptop, 9 out of 10 times they're gonna have a mobile device, depending on their age. So there's things that we're taking into account with regard to that as well. We'll move on to our third question, Ken, but thank you. There's some really amazing points there. This is something which you just touched on previously, and just at the beginning of the webinar. A lot has been said about social distancing, right, during this time. Everyone's talking about social distancing. It's in the news. We've been encouraged to do it. And I understand that you're not a fan of the phrase, right? Tell us a little bit why you're not a fan of the phrase social distancing. And I guess what this question is leading into is why do you feel it's important for teachers to try and keep that social, emotional connection alive with their students right now?
Yeah, it's something that's been troublesome for me since I've been an educator, is the terminology we use. I mean, words matter, and education is ripe with the use of deficit language, and now you're seeing this phrase being applied across the board and being used by social media, or excuse me, by the mainstream media. What we want is physical distancing. So when I go outside, you want to maintain, a minimum distance of 1 meter, 1.5 meters. So for those of us in the US, that's just right, or just over 3.5 feet. And then I even read where if you're out jogging, you want it to be more around 2 meters, just over 2 meters, or 6 feet. So the physical distance is important, but the social distancing is not, it's not the right phrase. We want to maintain social connections. And that's why I was sharing earlier, if you have the ability to have a video conferencing with a class or with classmates or with colleagues, do it. And here's the thing. I actually encourage teachers, pick a time during the day that you protect and use that time for social hour. If you've got colleagues that you would hang out with during lunch, say, you know what, from during the lunch hour, let's plan a video chat where we can just hang out, something along those lines. We have to remain socially connected, because if you take it literally, which unfortunately I have talked to some people that have, and they're starting to change it, social distancing is the equivalent to self-imposed isolation. And
Right.
that is no good for our mental health. And so that's why before we even started, I want to ask everyone, is everyone doing okay? Are they doing their self-care? And I'm glad someone even put that's what I said. Self-care is not selfish. So are you doing things for self-care? Well, guess what? Some of that self-care is things like all this week I've had Google Hangout or Zoom meetings with my friends that are educators across the country. And it's literally been, let's spend a half an hour and let's socialize. We don't need to
Right.
talk work. We don't need to talk business. We don't need to talk about, we're just socializing. A close friend of mine who lives in Texas, he and I did a little photo creativity challenge on Instagram. We're going to do another one. And I got feedback from that from some of my friends that are like, this was a good creative outlet. Listen, here's something for everyone on this webinar. You know how we always talk about creativity in schools? Now's your chance to do that.
Right.
Now's
Right.
your chance to do that. Now you don't have someone saying, well, are you following the standards, or are you doing this or doing that? I mean, no. Now's our chance to say, okay, I'm creative at heart, which I would argue all educators are creative because they have to be, just in the day-to-day stuff. Now your chance to say, what was something I would have wanted to do with my students that I can adapt into a distance learning model that gives them the flexibility to be creative? And keep in mind, a creative outlet is a type of self-care, and it might be something that creates different and varying degrees of a unique type of engagement as well. So there.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. And it just reminds me, when I was a kid, I remember in the UK we have the 6 week summer holidays. And by the end of the 6 weeks, you were itching to get back to school, because you're missing your friends, you're missing the routine, you're missing the structure. As much as you might say, I hate school, I don't want to go, blah, blah, blah. I think that
Right.
a lot of the little ones will probably be wondering where this all their friends have gone, right? And their teachers. And I know from speaking to a lot of teachers that the relationships and the friendships that they built with their students, are very important. So I think that you're 100% right, Ken. Finding an hour in the day, even less, to do something fun, to reach out and connect with somebody that you may not have spoken to in a while, or somebody that you usually do, just to, like you said, bridge that gap and kind of fight against the phrase social distancing. I guess I'm not going to be using that anymore. I'm going to use physical distancing, because you're right, it sounds antisocial. So yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I'm glad I saw that. I discovered when I was going through your Twitter feed, Ken. That was the first time that I'd actually discovered that, and thought about it and kind of checked myself and be like, yeah, that's so true. We've got every news outlet using the phrase social distancing, when in actuality, does that do more harm than good? When we have technology, when we've got Zoom, we've got FaceTime, why not build those connections? It doesn't mean that you've got to isolate, like you said. So yeah, some really amazing points there. Um, Talking about bridging the gap, what do you think educators can do to bridge the gap when it comes to more vulnerable students? So we mentioned, we had somebody in the chat mention, special ed students during this time. What can educators do to bridge that gap? Like I said, teachers undoubtedly, they create bonds with students that can very often be, teachers can be formative figures in a child's life. I remember when I was in school, a lot of teachers that I had, they were major figures in my life. They inspired me. They, helped me up when I was down. How can a teacher maintain these types of relationships and friendships and ensure that their students are okay whilst also in a remote learning situation? And
Right.
I guess
Right.
in particular with these more vulnerable students, I guess.
So a couple of things to share with you on that. There was an article that I just read, which before we're done, I can post a link in the chat here, and I'm going to cite it in one of my blog postings. One is when we're video chatting with students, for those that are using video chatting with students, you want to just be aware of the fact that not every student wants you to be able to see, like you can here, where they live and what the conditions are that they live in. Okay, so forcing students to have their camera on and show me where you are and show me you can be a trauma inducer, for one.
Right.
And that's why for me, if you want to talk about the creative thing, one of the things that I've actually encouraged educators to do if they use Zoom, which one, obviously be aware of the ways you can lock down your Zoom meeting, is to have students do a creative activity where they design their virtual background that they use for Zoom. Okay. So that way they maintain a degree of safety and privacy when it comes to that. Okay. So now that's number one.
I think we may have lost the connection, Ken.
But what a close friend of mine, he and I talk, is to be a curator of your learners. And what do I mean by that? Now, say it again, please.
Sorry, I think it was probably my internet connection that just froze up. I just please keep going. It was
Oh,
just me. I
there
thought,
we
yeah,
go.
yeah, I think
I
I
can
lost
see
you.
you. Can you see me? Can everybody
I
still
can
hear?
I can see. I think everyone can hear us. Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
There we
Okay.
go.
No
Okay.
worries. Perfect. Yeah, yeah, chat. Perfect. So here's the thing. We were talking about this. It's a very close friend of mine, and ultimately we both came to the conclusion of a phrase. And his name is Fernando Chavez. He's UCLA Fern on Twitter. But we were saying now's when educators can be curators of their own learners. And what I mean by that is you can now start to get to know your students even better to identify ways that you can create more individualized, responsive approach to their learning. And
Right.
that in and of itself is equitable because you are making sure that all of the support, resources, and needs that each individual student has, you are making sure that they get that. And part of being able to do that is, again, being a curator of your learners. So it's asking questions like, what have you found to be most effective in learning in your home? Are there any resources of support that I could provide you to be able to remain effective? Are there any platforms that you feel are beneficial for you to represent your learning? Are there any platforms that you feel will help us be able to learn together as a class or as a community? I'm like, this is, in all honesty, what I've told many of my friends that are classroom teachers is if you know you're likely to have students that you have now next year, or
Yeah.
you are able to connect with students now that you will have next year, this is the perfect time for you to do what you can't do at the beginning of the school year, and that is get to know your learners so that ideally when school resumes in the fall, not only have you already made a connection, you already know each and every one of your learners, and you're already in a position to be responsive to their needs. And I think doing that and really putting it to being more learner centered, which we hear a lot, that goes a long way with students. I mean, I say it all the time when I talk about social and emotional learning. What are the three areas of need that we all have? We want to be seen, we want to be heard, and we want to be loved. Now is the perfect time to be able to make that connection. And I do want to stress something else because it is something that I'm noticing as well. Not every student has internet access. Not every student's internet access is going to be robust. Not every student is going to have broadband access. And so, in terms of that, guess what? Hopefully, they do have. Pick up the phone. I mean, there's
Right.
ways that we can maintain a connection that breaks down the barriers. So, going back to where you showed that graphic that had that fence and I had
Mhm.
liberation down underneath that, what can we do to tear that fence down? Okay, so do you have internet access? Great, some do. Do you not? I see where some school districts are giving out hotspots to kids to be able to use in the home. That's great. My question, of course, is what's going to happen in September? Do you take those back and then now you essentially re-engage into the digital divide, the digital equity gap? Okay, so that's one. Then the other is looking at, okay, can I pick up the phone and call the families? I mean, like, there's ways to stay connected that I think are far more important than anything that students are going to learn. And in fact, I mean, I remember reading an article about this that we generally are not, our learning is not optimized when we're in a traumatic situation. And right now it
Mm.
is a traumatic situation for all of us in varying degrees. So we want to stay engaged, again, stay socially connected, and use this as an opportunity to get to know the students that much better so that we can meet their needs, so that they know that, yeah, you might be at home, we might be physically distant, but I see you and I hear you.
Amazing. And I think we've got some awesome ideas and that just popped up in the chat. One from Eileen. who says that Eileen says, I think the most important thing to remember if your area doesn't have access to internet, satellite devices, and that type of thing, is to give children responsibilities that they may not have already had.
Yeah.
Involve them in decision making, and allow them to create their own daily schedules. And we've got one from Anne as well, which I think is an amazing idea. As a history teacher, rather than packets, we are encouraging kids to keep a journal and collect artifacts either on paper or digitally to document this moment in history. Uh, we will be the diaries and primary sources for future kids will read and learn about this moment in history. Yeah, really, really cool. I think that what you were talking about then, Ken, being creative, I think is really amazing ideas there. I think it's having chances to really, give kids. And this really leads us on to our next question amazingly as well. I think it's giving kids tasks and assignments and things to do, which may go against the grain a little bit and maybe new and novel, but which are exciting. Not everybody has access, right? So, like you said, you can pick up the phone, give them perhaps a long-term assignment to do. So it could be keeping a daily diary, something that even if they're not necessarily connected to the class, they know that by sitting down and doing this long-term assignment, they're engaging and they're learning, and they're doing something educational as well. But I think that's really awesome because it leads into what my next question was. Given the situation right now, I think a lot of teachers are struggling with what types of activities to involve their kids in, which direction, which trajectory to send their students on when it comes to their learning. So, what in your opinion, Ken, what types of projects or assignments would you say suit a remote learning environment? Should it just? It's definitely not just business as usual for educators. Are there other areas of focus like creativity, collaboration, visual learning, that type of thing that you think should be emphasized right now?
Yes. And it goes back to being curators of your learners. Um, you know, Try to get a deeper understanding of what resources your students have access to in the first place. I think that to me would be the driver for anything that I would do. If I were still in the classroom right now, my first big question would be, one, making sure that all of my students are taking care of their mental health. That'd be
Hmm.
first.
Hmm.
Are you doing okay? Here are some things to do. Here are things to be mindful of. I did post on Twitter. There's an Instagram account that I follow called K Nicole Writing. So it's Katrina Nicole, and she posts monthly self-care journal prompts. And so I posted
Right.
one a few days ago on that. But those types of things can be adapted to students to where it helps students understand and identify what am I thinking and how am I feeling. And I think
Right.
that's the first step. No matter what, do that first. Okay.
Right.
Once you've done that, I would look at doing things that, okay, what resources do you have in the home? What support do you have in the home? What is to some degree, of course, there's the privacy thing, and we have to be mindful of that. But what spaces do you have at home to where maybe you can do some writing, or if you have access to a tablet device or pencils and papers, can you do some sketch noting or some drawing, something to keep your brain active, but do it in a way that is mindful of the fact that not every student is going to have access to the exact same resources. And here's where my cultural competency lens comes in. When we do this, we want to do it in a way that doesn't place a higher value on those that do have access versus those that
Mm.
don't. It's all around things like, what are the ways in which we can capture how we're thinking and how we're feeling, and what resources do you have in the home to be able to do that?
Right.
Something even like that. And again, it's doing it in a way that that is doesn't place a higher value on one more than the other. And I sadly I am seeing a degree of what I call elitism going on as well, as far as, oh, we're doing all these cool things and we're doing all this, and I'm like, that's great, that works for you, but guess what? That's not necessarily representational of many, and quite frankly, most.
Hmm.
And I think it's I don't want to be critical of educators. I think that ultimately what we want to do is we want to understand that not everyone has access to the same things. Not everyone has the same opportunities. And it goes back to the equity thing. And so if we're just understanding of that, then there are ways that we can circumvent what those that are lacking of access, of no consequence or no decision making of their own, to say, look, I see you, I hear you, and here's how we can work around that so that you are still included and involved in what we're doing.
Amazing. We've got some comments here in the chat. I've got one from C. Fisher says that I'm feeling that districts are pushing more for the instruction like they are used to, rather than worrying about the self-care aspect or even their staff. Can you comment on that at all, Ken?
Yeah, I can. You know, I, that's one where there's a probably a degree of district leadership that there's a disconnect on what they think can happen and what actually is happening. And so
Mm,
for me, in that context, I would encourage any educator where the district is doing that to um, do the best you can maneuvering around that. And I'm not one of those speakers that says, oh no, just go against the grain. I know what it's like sometimes when you go against the grain and what consequences come with that. Most of my career is that, which is a whole nother conversation to have as to one of the reasons why I'm no longer in the classroom. In the context of districts saying, okay, well, you have to do all these things, what I would encourage anyone on this webinar to do is say, okay, if I have to do all these things, what are the ways that I can incorporate some of that into me helping support my students' needs so that I can say, well, you know, we didn't finish all 10, but we finished 7 of them. Because ultimately, leadership has to recognize that unless you can guarantee that every single student has access to the same resources, you already, by doing something, a mandate like that, you're already increasing a divide that existed before we were into this situation.
mm. Yeah, I think we can see
So
on the chat there.
yeah, I think it's just, you know, again, for those in the chat that are in that type of environment, let me just say I see you and I understand you because I've been there. Do the best you can to work in and around that. I'm not going to tell you to tell them no, I'm not doing it. It doesn't work that way. I think the most important thing is to just understand that there's a disconnect and that you are going to highly likely to know your students better than someone who's giving you a top-down mandate, and just do the best you can to meet the needs of the students that is still doesn't put a target on your back.
Right, right. Yeah, because I think that that is probably something that we are forgetting about. It's probably something that I forget about as well, is that there are definitely politics when it comes to the relationship between districts and teachers, teachers and parents, parents and students, that type of thing. So it's about navigating that political structure as well, I guess, in your attempts to try and bridge those gaps. And I think that we're seeing from the chat that definitely emotional support is extremely important. So
Oh, it's
again, yeah, I'd reiterate what Ken said on that.
Listen, I won't mention the names for privacy purposes, but I've been on Zoom calls with quite a few of my close friends that are educators that, I ask them, okay, how you doing? They're like, oh, I'm great. And I'm like, is me, how you doing? And then of course,
Yeah,
within a minute, they start breaking down
yeah,
and I'm
yeah.
like, good. And they're like, and then here's something for everyone on this call too, is they start breaking down. And then what do we do when we start crying a lot of times? They apologize. I'm like, it's a natural emotion. Don't apologize.
Right.
It's fine. Let it out. I'm here for you. I'm here to support you. I don't have students anymore, but I am an educator, and I do believe my default is always going to be to support the educators first, as on
Right.
a human level, and then we'll get into the tech stuff. And so for
Right.
me, it's like let it out because it's an outlet. It's a natural emotion. Do not apologize for a natural emotion. And yes, men can cry too. And then once you've done that, it's like hopefully you'll feel a little bit better. And then we'll talk about things that I can do to support you, whether it's us co-teaching. I've had the privilege of co-teaching a number of classes over the last couple of weeks with very close friends of mine, where I'm like, you know what? Why don't we do a project together? And here's the cool thing: the projects we're doing are not necessarily part of the normal curriculum where we're
Right.
having students watch we had students watch certain YouTube videos, I'm sorry, TED Talks, and
Right.
then there's a whole series of questions we do, and the TED Talks are more around social perspectives and things like that, and it's actually been fantastic. And the good thing, now granted, these are students that do have access, so I do want to be clear on that. The good thing is it actually has engaged the students even more because it's not the normal day-to-day standard stuff that they were getting in school. So it's just, again, I'm sharing with everyone here, these are all ways of doing things. They're not the answer, but they are possibilities for answers for all of you.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that, yeah, to reiterate what you're exactly what you're saying, Kev, the emotional side of it is really really important. I think that we've seen like a really interesting, I don't want to say breakdown, but I say evolution, I think, of the way that educators and people in general have reacted to this from the start. I think there's always like, kind of like the 7 stages of grief, right? It's or is it five? I'm not sure, but it's like, there's this kind of disbelief first of all. There's like, everything's kind of going to be okay. It's probably not going to affect us, and then it does, and then you're in a situation where you're like, okay, I'm very excited, like I'm gonna do some amazing things right now, and then the reality dawns, and you're like, oh wow, okay, so some of my students don't have internet. My district isn't letting me do X, Y, and Z, and then you kind of sink into this little bit of a low where you might feel like what you're doing isn't as good as it could be. So I think that that's really important. Focus on yourself. Look at what you want to get out of this as well as an educator. What do you want your students to remember this time as being, when they look back at it in a few years, and then just kind of work backwards from the student. And another really cool thing that I saw in the chat, I can't scroll up and find it now, but someone was saying, don't ask what your students don't have, what technology they don't access, see what they do have, right? And then work from there, which
That is
sounds really
asset
simple.
language. Yes,
Yeah,
that
it sounds
asset language. I don't want to know what you don't have. I want to know what you do have. That's right.
right. It sounds really, really simple, but it's like that. It's just having this paradigm shift in your head and discovering resources that, we're staring you in the face the whole time. But quite often we get wrapped up in our own routines and our own way of doing things that we forget to realize that most of us have actually got phones that you can use to pick up and speak rather than just have a video call. So yeah, I
That's
think
right.
that some amazing comments in the chat box, guys. I think that this is a subject which we could probably do another webinar about in the future, mindfulness and that type of thing with regard to the situation. But I think it leads on to the final question, just before we kind of go into some more general stuff. Um, what would you say is the biggest positive that educators can take from this whole experience? Because it is quite a difficult. We know it's a difficult time for educators right now, and it is hard for educators and everybody in general to stay motivated and to. We know that it's going to end at some point, but during this time, what a year from now, what types of
Yeah.
things should have gotten better after this experience? And I guess you can talk about from the student perspective, the teacher perspective, the district perspective, whatever it might be, what types of stuff are we hoping has improved from this experience a year from now?
So, one, I would encourage everyone on this webinar to really, really look at, lean on, listen to, and support those that are actually doing the work. And I mean that as far as there's a lot of messaging out there on social media, especially of, oh, well, you can do this, or here's this list, or here's that list. My default, which is part of the reason why I'm able to share a lot of these things with everyone on this webinar, has always been who's in the classroom, who's doing the work. And what are the varying, fortunately for me, my PLN is very, very vast, very diverse, very broad across K through 20. In my conversations, I'm able to essentially curate, again, curator of the learner. I'm able to curate all this, be able to share it in a way through my lens, which is through the equity and digital equity lens. I think there's a number of positives that ideally will come out of this that I think will serve us on a global level, and then all of us on a national and then a local level. I think the global level aspect is that it's really emphasizing how technology doesn't make us more divided. It actually makes us more connected if we're using it in the right capacity.
Right.
That's number one. Okay. So now all those people that are saying, oh, technology makes us divided, they can now go ahead and go back into the shadows where they belong, because if you use it properly, it makes us more connected. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Mm-hmm.
one. Number two, what I'm also seeing, which is something I'm a strong advocate and believer in, is other schools and classes getting connected and doing some degree of shared learning together. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's
Yeah.
that aspect as well. Okay. And I'm speaking strictly global right now. Going now national, in different countries, you're starting to see, which sadly is stuff that I know I and many others have been talking about for at least a half a dozen years now, is the idea that, okay, technology is important. We do need to invest in the infrastructure. I know here, it's not even just here in the US, in many other countries I've had the opportunity to work in and even advise ministries of education. It's the infrastructure. Why is it that I can go into certain zip codes of certain cities or certain municipalities or states and know that you don't have broadband access. I mean, it's ridiculous. So there needs to be an investment in the infrastructure. And now I'm going to put on my political hat for a moment. If you want to talk about job creation and you want to talk about the economies of the future, there must be an infrastructure for everyone to be connected. And this is why here in the US especially, I've been pushing for, and I will continue to push for, the internet being designated as a utility. Because once you do that, there has to be the investment in the infrastructure. There has to be the affordability and financial access to it, no matter where we are. Okay, so there's that aspect. The other more national aspects are now the proverbial curtain has been drawn to show that the inequities that exist in schools are now magnified. They didn't just all of a sudden come up. And this is why I share with people that, things like equity is not a buzzword, digital equity is not a buzz phrase. These are things that have always existed. Okay, now you're starting to see it even more. So now it's time to start looking at what are we actually really doing in education to really support the needs of all of our learners, and all means all. Okay. Now on a more localized level, it's actually really national, international, national, and local. It's what types of professional development experiences have you had over the last 12 to 24 months? What types of sessions did you attend? Who are the presenters? How is that working for you now? And I don't mean to be callous in saying that, but I am kind of at my tipping point when it comes to things like when I look at a conference and I see the sessions, and again, going back to what we shared before, 100 apps in 60 minutes. How's that working for everybody now? The toxic positivity and platitudes doesn't help any one of us. And I saw it brought up in the chat earlier around, grit and perseverance. Those are important for us to be mindful of, but I also want to caution everyone, those are on a case-by-case basis, because I've seen it over and over again. Oh, well, we just need to show grit. We just need to. Listen, I can take everyone on this webinar, if I had the opportunity, I could take them all to a school that I used to work at over in Southeast LA, and I will tell you that grit and perseverance were the students surviving and getting to school safely every morning. Okay, so my whole point is not to diminish the value and impact of use of some of the terminology we have. It's that we cannot apply this blanket, overarching approach to these words. It has to be from a case-by-case basis. There's nuance to it. And so I think in terms of all of this, one of the other positives is that I am seeing also is that a lot of educators are rallying around each other and really saying, what can I do to support you? What can I do to support you? And it's one of the things that there is hope for humanity. And for me, the humanity is in terms of us as educators. And that's why for me, I was thrilled that you asked for me to be on this webinar, and that was why I was like, absolutely, I'll do this. And I'm glad that we have in the chat, we've got representations from literally around the world, and I've seen everyone's just putting in examples of what's going on in their locality. That again, ideally, we can curate all that and say, okay, this worked in this country. There's a piece of that actually might work for me in my in my capacity as well. So in the end, I like to use the analogy in many of my talks that, this whole idea of what we're doing as educators is a marathon, not a sprint, and and we're in it for the long game. But the key is that it's not who crosses the finish line first that wins. It's that we all cross the finish line together, because ultimately we are a community of educators, and what happens to me here in Los Angeles is going to happen to an educator in halfway around the world. And so we need to err on the side of being supportive of each other, being mindful of our differences, and being able to make the appropriate connections to be supportive of each other for the benefit of ourselves and for the support and growth of our students.
Amazing. I think the reaction to the things that you've been saying in the chat, Ken, are fantastic. I'm a little interested as well. You used a phrase that I've never heard before: toxic positivity. I've never heard that before. I'd like to know what do you mean by that? What does that word mean? Because it sounds like something I'd like to start using.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad you're saying that. So basically it works like this. As we all know, too much of anything can be bad. And we have to have balance, and we have to be pragmatic about the balances that we have. And so a lot of times when I mention that, educators, well, no, we should be positive all the time. And I'm like, there's such thing as too much. For example, too much water and too much oxygen will kill you.
Right.
And so it's not that we have to be negative. It's that we want to be positive, but not to the point where it creates a dissonance from some of the realistic challenges that we have. And that's why I just caution everyone on some of the terminology that you've seen used in education, as far as, I'll go through the list: the grit, the perseverance, the growth mindset, the failure, all of those things. Yes, they're all important for us to be mindful of, but not at the expense of a degree of cognitive dissonance, that we lose sight of what is pragmatic and realistic within the context of ourselves and the environments that we work in.
Amazing. Yeah,
So,
that makes sense.
and now let me add just one more thing. I'm going to juxtapose toxic positivity and positive support. Okay. Toxic positivity is a degree of tone deafness that, oh, everything's great. Everyone can do this. You're all wonderful. You're wonderful. The world is amazing. Unicorns and rainbows. Support. We all need to be supportive of each other. Everything can be great. I understand that we all have challenges, but how can we help ourselves and others navigate in and around those challenges so that we are continually making progress? See the difference?
Right. Yeah, completely. Because I think I've seen that, and I've definitely experienced it, but I've not been able to articulate it well. So I think that's probably my new phrase to learn from this is toxic positivity, knowing that sometimes stuff just isn't great. You can't, no matter how you paint it. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Yeah, right.
It's life.
I think, I think that brings us to what looks like, unfortunately, the almost the end of our hour. I'm going to share the Wakelet webinar certificate with you all. James has already shared it there. Just whilst we have this, and just before we go to final thoughts from Ken, I'd love to hear Ken's final thoughts. I'm sure you would as well. Um, we're trying with these webinars to not really talk too much about Wakelet, the platform, just because we feel like there's so much that we as a team can learn as well from having these discussions. So these really fall into like our community webinar kind of series. But James, I think James in the chat, we have webinars going on every single week. We try and do at least 2 community webinars like this a month, and then every week we've got Wakelet beginner webinars. Now, one of the things that we've found is that throughout all of this, just as a closing note for me, throughout all of this, one of the things that I found amazing is the willingness that teachers have, despite all the things that are going on, to actually learn and to put themselves in situations like this webinar where they get to learn from others and make new connections. It's very easy, I think, during times of trauma and times of kind of anguish like this to kind of just curl up into a ball and just shake until it's over, right? And I think that one of the
Right.
things that I've seen from educators, which is a little bit different from other professions that I've seen, is just the willingness to really put yourselves out there and learn and ask questions. Some of the webinars that we did in the past with Tish and Deb, we did one. Tish said a really good point. She said, "There's no such thing as a stupid question in this. This everybody is new to the situation. Even if people look like they know what they're doing, 9 times out of 10 they probably don't. So don't worry about asking the silly questions, because there is no silly questions. And at Wakelet, we've tried to kind of simplify our language a lot more and not just assume that every teacher knows what a URL is, for example, or what copying and pasting a link is. Some teachers don't. For some teachers, this is the first time that they're using technology.
Exactly.
First time they've opened it up and started using it. But yeah, I'm going to share the certificate as well. This certificate is going to it will be expiring in a few hours, so please make sure that you click it to get your certificate. Share them online as well. You can at us or use the hashtag Wakelet webinar. And I'm also going to share one last thing with you just before we jump on to Ken's final words and see this one out. At Wakelet, we're trying to do as much as we can to make it as easy as possible for you guys to transition into remote learning. And one of the things that we've found has been really positive, and I remember speaking with you about this, Ken, when we met at TCA, was the Student Ambassador Program. And this is something that we created before this whole outbreak, and we were just using it as a way for teachers to really plug in those gaps in their curriculum. So things like creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, communication. So we've created a student ambassador program that a lot of educators are using now with their students who do have access to devices. It's for 13 and over, and we were talking before about long-term projects that students can use to really feel like they're doing something. If you can't have that direct one-on-one communication with them every day, this is a really good way for them to just kind of go through each topic. For each task that they complete, they'll get a badge, and at the end, they'll get a student ambassador certificate, and they'll become an official Wakelet student ambassador. So it's something really productive for students to do. Ken, this has been incredible. Honestly, I think this has probably been one of our best webinars. It's been one of my favorite webinars for sure. I've learned a lot. Let's go to you to see us out. Any final words of advice for teachers and anything in particular for this situation?
Yeah, the chat has been great too. I've been
For
watching
sure.
down here. I'm trying to keep my eyes on the camera, but everyone, everyone who's still on the call, thank you so much for sharing your ideas and thoughts and even challenges in the chat. Again, this is we're in this together. We're in this together. We're going to get out of it together, and then we're going to stay socially connected.
Right, right. Right. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you all so much for taking the time out of your busy days to join us. We will be leaving the chat open for sure. We'll leave it open for the next 10 minutes or so. Ken, we can just click the on or off audio. I think you can leave. I think you can click the cross button and then just instead of clicking end event, I think just cancel it. I'm not sure, but don't click end event. Or you can just mute your mic and your video until this.
I know that there are some folks that any of you, if in our conversation you have a question that's either related to what we were talking about or something that either Misbah or I might be able to help you on, please definitely put that in the chat.
Yeah, for sure. So what we'll do is, yeah, we will be sending everybody a link to the recorded webinar. We will be releasing it on Twitter as well in the coming days. But yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time out. Ken, thank you so much as well. I know that you're extremely busy. I think that you've dropped some amazing gems of knowledge on us all today and really helped us come to terms with what's going on. We really appreciate it. I think that you in particular, your way of speaking, the way of understanding and articulating certain points, you're one of those rare people where you know the thoughts that people are thinking but don't get to articulate because we don't know how, you say it and then it's like light bulb. That's exactly what I think a lot of people have experienced.
Yeah, yeah.
Right,
Yes.
it's so true. So I really appreciate you joining us today, Ken. Hopefully we can have another one of these soon. Everybody in the chat, we'll leave the chat open for a few more moments, but thank you all. Stay safe.